Hello, everyone. Today we continue talking about how many Roman influences were embedded into early ways of Christian thinking. One of the things that we have emphasized in previous episodes is that the Church and Rome shared certain commonalities. Amongst this was the reception of all sorts of various peoples from around the world. In many ways, the early apostles of Christianity echoed the cosmopolitan nature of Rome. And we saw in a previous episode how Paul the Apostle emphasized the importance of accepting people who are different from you. And Paul was not the only disciple. You had the Apostle Peter, who also echoed similar sentiments. Whenever he said, quote, "Understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." Now, it's important to note that these early ideas of spiritual equality were not only cross-cultural, they were in many ways cross-class. The Apostle Luke wrote, quote, "The Spirit has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." But it's important to note it's not only people who are of different cultures, people who are of different wealth, but people who do things completely different and even opposite of what you do. I'm talking about what we call deviance. According to the Apostle Luke, Jesus, quote unquote, welcomes all the sinners. So therefore, many of the writers of the Bible employed similar concepts to that of Rome, that is, accepting people who are different, accepting people from different cultures. It's important to note that in many cases they use the exact same words, that is, the exact same verbs, which Romans used to describe its assimilation process. Now, Rome was not the only influence on Christianity, particularly on the multicultural aspects of Christianity. We have to go back to the original messages of Christ. The idea that Jesus died for all humanity made the early disciples of the church confront the idea of cultural difference head on. And according to Christ, love is how you bridge these differences. Christ held the idea of loving thy neighbor as one of the greatest ideals a Christian could aspire to. In the Gospel of Matthew, he wrote, quote, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Now, this is an extremely simple message. Your neighbor could be anyone. This idea of loving thy neighbor disregards all group ties. It disregards claims to kinship, community, ethnicity, or religious affiliation. These distinctions are frankly irrelevant. Christ's commandment to love thy neighbor fostered also a practice of empathy, that is, caring for the inner experiences, the inner emotions, the inner feelings of your neighbor, regardless of who or what your neighbor is. We are to recognize everyone as potentially our neighbors, according to Christ. This is because, according to the early Christians, every single human was created in God's image. This was fundamentally a command to transcend our group, our origins, our ethnicities, our cultures. Moreover, Christianity is where we get our very 21st century idea of social justice from. Historian Marvin Perry argued that Christianity inherited the social justice tradition of the Hebrews. According to the ancient Hebrews, social evils were at the very same time spiritual evils. The early Hebrews fostered an idea of what we would call social conscience. That is, understanding your place in the world and how your actions and behavior affect the other people around you. This influenced the idea that everyone has a God-given right to be treated fairly, to receive justice. The biblical maxim, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor," carried this tradition through time. In fact, the depictions of Jesus in the New Testament effectively laid the seeds for radical critiques of the social order, including social inequalities and social hierarchies. We have to remember that one of the things Jesus told his disciples to do was avoid the trappings of material wealth, but moreover, to assist others who are struggling in their daily life. Collectively, This is a message of social inclusion, including the sinners, including the poor. We have to remember that these ideas took centuries to become recognizable to us in our modern times. That is, these ideas took hundreds and hundreds of years to transform into what we think of social justice, inclusion, and equality nowadays. Ideas are not set in stone. In fact, ideas are fundamentally unstable. Each individual who receives an idea, who reads it who reads an idea somewhere, hears it, they interpret the idea from their own individual, unique life experiences. And no individual experiences life in exactly the same way. So you have all these infinite interpretations of what any single idea could possibly mean, even if all these ideas originate from the same source, like the idea of equality, which began as a message of spiritual equality in the hands of Paul, but if you read from Jesus, it's significantly more socially inclusive. Think of ideas like the childhood game of telephone, where one person starts a chain reaction, you whisper something in one person's ear, and it goes around the entire group, whisper by whisper, ear to ear, until everyone waits to see what comes out at the very end. Usually, if you play this game, it's some extreme distortion that bears no resemblance to the original. This is fundamentally how ideas work. And this is what I mean when I say that ideas are unstable. The point is, the ideas of equality that we have been exploring in the last couple of episodes are unrecognizable to us. By modern standards, the ideas of equality, which we have talked about in these previous episodes, are deeply flawed and exclusionary. But these earlier forms of ideas, such as equality, were rooted in the environment, the social and cultural environment in which they originated. Societies which were unequal in many different ways. Specifically, the idea of equality in the hands of Paul and the other early Christians were limited to spiritual equality. They had no bearing or ramification for your actual standing in society. But over time, people will ask, well, why not? Why doesn't this idea have a bearing on how we should be treated in society? Why shouldn't the social world reflect the spiritual world? Indeed, we can ask, why did it even take so long for these alternative and dissenting ideas of equality to even emerge? And a major reason was the monopolization of literacy by the Catholic Church. For European elites during the medieval ages, Latin was an important part of your status and your power. By restricting literacy and therefore language, you could control the means of information. You can control what people think. For many centuries, the Bible was in Latin, masses were said in Latin, and only societies well off knew Latin. In basic terms, the elite monopolization of Latin literacy meant that alternative interpretations couldn't take root. By the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther wrote his critique against the Catholic Church not in Latin, but in his own vernacular of German. In the wake of the Reformation, European elites would stop using Latin and start using their own native languages to translate the Bible and to discuss the Bible, and this opened the possibility for more and more diverging interpretations. A prince would interpret Martin Luther's message differently from a Catholic priest, and both of those two examples would interpret Martin Luther's critique differently than a peasant, reflecting the different ideas that social positions can have on the individual, the influences, I mean. Basically, different people reading the same text could come to vastly different conclusions of what that text should mean. And these people all interpret the message from their own position in society and their own groups that they belong to in that society. And we could see these many different interpretations throughout space and time. Thomas Müntzer took Luther's critique and turned it into a social economic critique of income inequality, with many historians arguing that Thomas Müntzer represented a godly communistic society. We also see a push for a much broader idea of equality in the English feminist forerunner, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, some historians argue that religion was central to her ideas of female liberation. Others argue that she was completely skeptical of traditional Christian dogma. However, her ideas were congruent, if not based upon Christian ideas. Nonetheless, Wollstonecraft did write, quote, "The image of God implanted in our nature is now more rapidly expanding, and as it opens, liberty with maternal wings seems to be soaring to regions far above vulgar annoyance, promising to shelter all mankind." If we look at American history, we can see the idea of Christianity and social justice went hand in hand. Such was the case for the liberated slave turned abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass argued that American slaveholders committed blasphemy for violating ideas of Christian liberty and Christian justice. We also see this very relationship in the 20th century socialist leader Eugene Debs, who rhetorically asked, "What is socialism?" and also rhetorically implied, quote, "merely Christianity in action. It recognizes the equality in men," which meant that Debs believed the social world should indeed reflect the spiritual world. You also see this tradition in Martin Luther King Jr., that is, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend as in spiritual leader of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, a reverend who is also a democratic socialist. Historians argue that these early Christian ideas, practices, and ethics laid the foundation for our modern liberal democratic societies. The idea that you have a social responsibility to improve the world around you, to make the world a better place for all humanity. A society in which its members are supposed to treat each other equally. It was certainly the Protestants who criticized the church that emphasized this idea of social justice. We could see this in the critiques against Catholic Church abuses, such as the selling of indulgences. The idea that that is a moral wrong done unto society. Overall, although these ideas are deeply flawed, they lead seeds that we in our modern times have been reaping.